Intro. Picture this. You've crossed the last threshold of life. The air is cool and still, like the inside of a sealed tomb. The world you knew is behind you. Your home. Your name spoken by living mouths. The warmth of the sun. Ahead is a vast, shadowed hall, where every step echoes like it's happening inside your own ribs. And waiting there, calm, unmoving, unreadable, is a figure with the head of a jackal. Not a monster, not a demon, a professional, a guardian. A divine specialist whose job is to make sure your death is handled correctly and your eternity is earned. This is Anubis, one of the most iconic gods of ancient Egypt, often mislabeled as the god of death, when his real purpose was far more specific and far more terrifying in a quiet way. Because Anubis isn't here to kill you. He's here to measure you. And if the scale doesn't balance, your story ends for good. Who Anubis really is. Anubis is one of those gods whose image alone carries a whole atmosphere. The jackal head, the tall ears, the sleek black fur, the gold collar, the posture of absolute control. Even if you know nothing else about Egypt, you've probably seen him on posters, in games, in movies, standing beside a sarcophagus like a supernatural bouncer. But in the ancient Egyptian world, Anubis wasn't a villain. He wasn't even primarily a ruler. He was something that mattered even more to ordinary people. He was the one who made death work. The Egyptians didn't treat death like a simple ending. They treated it like a complicated journey, one with rules, gates, rituals, and dangers. And if you wanted to survive that journey, you needed two things: your body cared for properly, your soul guided and judged properly. That's where Anubis comes in. He is associated with mummification, tomb protection, and most famously, the weighing of the heart, the moment when your moral life is tested on a scale, not by angry accusation, but by cosmic balance. So if you've ever heard Anubis is the Egyptian Grim Reaper, you can gently file that under, not exactly. He's not the Reaper. He's more like the mortician, the guardian, the guide, and the courtroom officer, all rolled into one. And to understand why he looks like a jackal in the first place, you have to step out of the temple and into the desert. Why a jackal? Ancient Egyptian cemeteries weren't typically placed in the soft green heart of the Nile Valley. They were often built at the edge, where the fertile land stopped and the desert began. Because the desert wasn't just emptiness. It was a boundary, a liminal zone between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But deserts have scavengers. And in Egypt, one of the most familiar scavengers was the jackal, along with wild dogs that roamed the edges of civilization. Now imagine what that meant to an ancient community. You bury your loved ones, you mark the grave, you leave offerings. And out there in the night, just beyond the last line of houses, there are animals that might dig, scatter, and desecrate what you've placed so carefully. That fear is real. And Egyptian religion often worked like this. When something is frightening, you don't just deny it, you transform it. If jackals threaten the dead, then the greatest guardian of the dead will be a jackal. Anubis becomes the divine version of that desert reality, an answer to the fear of violation, decay, and disrespect, not to mention the deeper fear underneath it. What if death makes you powerless? Anubis represents a promise that even in death there is order. Someone is watching. Someone is guarding. Someone is making sure the rules are followed. But protection wasn't his only job. Because in Egypt, the dead didn't just need guarding. They needed preparation. Anubis and mummification. To modernize, mummification can look like a bizarre obsession with keeping a body intact. But to the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't a creepy hobby. It was engineering for eternity. The body wasn't just a shell to discard, it mattered. It was connected to the person's identity and survival. And the afterlife wasn't a vague spiritual cloud. It was often imagined as something stable and real, where you could eat, walk, speak, work, rejoice. But you couldn't do that if you weren't whole. So mummification was a sacred craft, a careful process meant to preserve the body so the person could continue. And Anubis is the patron of that craft. He is the overseer, the divine authority behind the embalmers, the one who makes sure the rites are correct, the spells are spoken, the procedures are done with dignity. In fact, embalmers sometimes wore masks of Anubis during rituals. Picture that. A priest leaning over a wrapped body, not as himself, but as the presence of the Jackal god, turning a human craft into a holy act. Because the Egyptians weren't thinking, how do we stop rot? They were thinking, how do we make this person fit for eternity? And that required more than technique. It required ritual order, purity, protection, correctness. Anubis becomes the symbol of that correctness. Death handled with precision, not panic. And if that sounds strange, here's a way to understand it. For Egypt, death wasn't chaos. Chaos was the enemy. Death needed to be controlled, shaped, guided, turned into a doorway instead of a disaster. And once the body was prepared, Anubis had another role: to guard what had been prepared against both thieves and darker forces. Tomb Guardian. Think of a tomb not as a simple grave, but as a house built for the longest residency imaginable. A place stocked with offerings, decorated with scenes, protected with inscriptions, sometimes filled with precious goods, because those objects weren't just wealth. They were tools for survival, symbols of status, tokens of identity. And all of that was vulnerable. Not just to animals, but to robbers, vandals, and time itself. Anubis stands at the edge of the tomb world like a living seal. He is invoked to protect the burial, to guard the body, to keep the sacred items sacred. And yes, Egyptian tombs sometimes include warnings that sound like curses, but those weren't just Hollywood threats. They were religious boundaries, a way of declaring, this place is protected by the gods. You do not cross this line without consequences. Anubis embodies that boundary. If you imagine the ancient world as a place with thin walls between life and death, then Anubis is one of the figures posted at the wall, ensuring it holds. But even if the tomb is protected, even if the body is preserved, that isn't the end of the story. Because the biggest danger isn't what happens to your tomb, it's what happens to you. And that brings us to the moment Anubis is most famous for, the scene that has outlived dynasties, empires, and millennia, the courtroom of the dead. Myth versus pop culture. Quick pause, because if your only exposure to Anubis is modern media, there are a few common misconceptions worth clearing up. First, the color black. Anubis is often shown with black fur, and people assume that means darkness, horror, or evil. But in Egypt, black was also the color of fertile soil, the rich silt left by the Nile floods. It represented rebirth, regeneration, life returning after death. Black is not demonic here, it's powerful and life-linked. Second, Anubis isn't the Egyptian Satan. Egyptian religion doesn't map neatly onto later devil versus God ideas. Anubis is not the enemy of the good gods. He is one of the forces that keeps the universe functioning. Third, Anubis doesn't decide your fate based on personal rage. He's not a judge who condemns you because he feels like it. His role is closer to a sacred official, ensuring the rules are followed. That's what makes him so unsettling, actually. He's not angry. He's impartial. Now, back to the courtroom. The weighing of the heart. In the Egyptian vision of the afterlife, the dead do not simply arrive and get assigned a destination. They are processed, tested, measured. One of the most famous versions of this appears in what we often call the Book of the Dead. Not a single book, but a collection of spells and teachings meant to guide a person through the dangers of the afterlife. And at the center of that journey is a scene that plays like a dream you can't wake up from. You stand before a set of scales. On one side is your heart. Not your brain, not your words. Your heart, the seat of your memory, intention, conscience, and identity. On the other side is a feather. The feather of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, justice, and cosmic order. Ma'at isn't just morality in a simple sense. She is the idea that reality itself has structure, and that human life is meant to align with it. So the question isn't, did you follow rules? The question is, did you live in balance with the order of the universe? And here is where Anubis stands. He doesn't glare. He doesn't threaten. He calmly adjusts the scale. He oversees the measurement. He ensures the process is correct. That's why his presence matters so much, because if the weighing is the most important moment of your afterlife, then you want it done fairly. And Anubis is the guarantee of fairness. As the scale tips, another god is nearby, Thoth, the divine scribe, recording the result with absolute precision. And lurking close, sometimes pictured beside the scale like a nightmare waiting for permission, is Amet, the devourer. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippo, made from the most feared animals in Egypt. Amet is not a ruler, not a queen, not a god you worship. She is the consequence. If your heart is heavier than the feather, heavy with wrongdoing, imbalance, violence, deception, selfishness, then your heart is fed to Amet. And what happens then? This is crucial. You aren't tortured forever. You are ended. Your existence is cut off. A second death, annihilation, oblivion. No eternal screaming, just nothing. Which, to many ancient Egyptians, was the worst outcome imaginable. But if your heart balances, if you've lived in alignment with Ma'at, then the path opens. You are welcomed into a blessed state, often imagined as a perfected version of life, with fields, peace, and continuity. Now, here's what makes this scene so powerful. It's not just a mythic image. It's a worldview. It says your life has weight. Your choices are real. Not because a god is watching to punish you, but because the universe itself has balance, and you can either live with it or against it. And in that moment, Anubis is the calm figure who makes sure the scale tells the truth. The afterlife journey map. So what does the whole afterlife journey look like? Quickly, as a map. First, death occurs, and the body is prepared through sacred rites. Without that, the journey is unstable. Second, the dead person enters the realm beyond, where they must navigate gates, obstacles, and spiritual dangers, often using spells, names, and declarations of identity. Third, they arrive at judgment, the weighing of the heart, where the moral truth of their life is measured against Ma'at. If they fail, their heart is devoured and their existence ends. If they pass, they move into a blessed afterlife, often pictured as fields and idealized daily life, order restored, peace achieved. So Anubis appears at the hinge point, between preparation and judgment, between death and destination. He is the one who makes the transition possible. A day in the life of an embalmer. Now imagine you're not a pharaoh. You're an ordinary Egyptian, a farmer, a craftsperson, a parent. You can't build a pyramid. You can't afford endless gold. But you still want the same thing everyone wants. For your loved ones to be treated with dignity. For their names to be remembered. For their souls to be safe. And that's where Anubis becomes deeply personal. Because Anubis isn't only in grand myths, he's in the practical fear and hope surrounding every funeral. Picture an embalming house, linen cloth, bowls of oils, incense smoke curling upward, priests speaking carefully memorized words. The tone is not horror, it's solemn craft. Every wrap of linen is an act of care. Every ritual phrase is a way of saying, you are not abandoned. To place Anubis over this process is to place divine attention over grief itself. It means death isn't a random theft. It's an event with procedure and protection. And when you're living in a world where disease, accidents, and hardship are close companions, that promise matters. Anubis and Osiris. At this point, you might be thinking, wait, doesn't Osiris rule the underworld? Yes. And this is where a lot of people get confused. Because Egyptian religion evolves over time, gods rise in prominence, merge in roles, shift in emphasis. Anubis is extremely ancient, one of the earliest major funerary deities. But as the cult of Osiris becomes central, Osiris takes the throne as the Lord of the Dead, the king figure, the one associated with resurrection. the one whose story becomes a model for what happens after death. So does Anubis get replaced? Not really. He gets specialized. Osiris becomes the ruler and central figure of afterlife hope. Anubis remains the professional guardian of the process, the one who prepares, protects, guides, and oversees the weighing. If Osiris is the king in the courtroom, Anubis is the officer who ensures the courtroom functions. And in a religion obsessed with correct procedure, that role is not small. It's essential. Why Anubis still fascinates us. So why does Anubis, out of all the Egyptian gods, remain so instantly recognizable? Part of it is visual. The jackal head is unforgettable. But deeper than that, Anubis represents something universal. He represents the human desire for death to make sense, for the end to have dignity, for the passage out of life to be guided, not chaotic. And he represents a kind of judgment that is both frightening and fair, not based on favoritism, not based on mood, but based on weight and truth. That's why he keeps returning in modern stories, sometimes twisted into a villain, sometimes turned into a cool aesthetic symbol, but always carrying that same core energy. Silent, watchful, certain. The god who doesn't threaten you with screams, but with a scale. Closing. So when you picture Anubis, don't picture a monster prowling through darkness. Picture a guardian at the boundary, a divine craftsman overseeing sacred preparation, a steady hand at the scales, ensuring your life is measured truthfully. Because in the Egyptian imagination, the greatest fear wasn't simply dying. It was being forgotten, dishonored, lost to chaos. And Anubis stands against that chaos. He is the promise that even after the last breath, there is still order, still ritual, still justice, still a path forward if your heart is light enough to pass. And the next time you see that jackal-headed figure in a movie or a game, remember, Anubis isn't there to take your life. He's there to see what you did with it